Okay. Yes, I did. Yes. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I see some new faces here. We are continuing with our journey in the book of Ezekiel. I don't know how many weeks it's been. I don't know, kind of like 45, 47 weeks already, more. We're approaching the end of the book. Yeah, we have to figure out what we're doing next. But today, we're going to go to chapter 43.
We need something uplifting for the next.
Yeah, I hear you, Shoshana. We need to figure out something uplifting for, yeah. This, listen, we had a lot of reason to do the book of Ezekiel. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Okay. So in the last 3 chapters or so, we discussed the temple itself, right? The structure and the measurements. So we kind of tried to stay away from all that boring stuff and try to talk more about the concept and what do we know and whatever about the third temple. And that was the, chapters 40, 41, and 42. Now we're coming to chapter 43, and finally we have another prophecy, but it's not only prophecy, it has kind of a spiritual content to it. So we're going to go back into the text. Okay? We haven't done that for a little bit. So I'm going to read the first 5 verses. Let's jump right into that, okay? ויוליכני אל השער, שער אשר פונה דרך הקדים. והנה כבוד אלוהי ישראל בא מדרך הקדים, וקולו כקול מים רבים, והארץ האירה מכבודו. וכמראה המראה אשר ראיתי, כמראה אשר ראיתי בבואי לשחט את העיר, ומראות כמראה אשר ראיתי על נהר כבר, ויפול על פניי, וכבוד אדוני בא אל הבית דרך שער, אשר פניו דרך הקדים. ותישאני רוח, ותביאני לחצר הפנימי, והנה מלא כבוד אדוני הבית. Let's do it in English. Then he led me to the gate, a gate that faces east, and behold, the glory of God of Israel was coming from the east. Its sound was like the sound of a multitude of waters, and the earth shone with his glory. It was a vision like the vision I had seen before, like the vision that I had seen when I came to destroy the city. The city, if I remember, it's Jerusalem. And visions like the vision I had seen at the river Kavar. That's in Babylonia. We talked about that river a long time ago. And I fell upon my face. The glory of Hashem then entered the temple by way of the gate that faced east. Then a wind lifted me. That's also significant because we learned that pasuk before. Up and brought me into the inner courtyard, and behold, the glory of Hashem filled the temple. Okay, what are we dealing with? First of all, there's a lot of semantics. There's a lot of significance to those choices of words. We're going to try to catch all of them. So first of all, Yechezkel is returned to the eastern gate. Right, so remember, after having all that visual tour, he's coming out from the temple, obviously in his vision, right? And now he's brought back into the eastern gate. And there's a special reason for that. He's watching the return of the Shekhinah, or the way they call Kvod Hashem. The glory of God returns from the east back into the temple. Now, Remember, like a year ago, when we discussed the chariot, remember that? I called it the drone. But that chariot, so now he's seeing it the third time. So in chapter 10, he sees that chariot carries the glory of God, the Shekhinah, from the temple through the eastern gate. And remember, it goes to the east, going to stop on Mount Olives, and then from that is going to continue with the children of Israel to Bavel. However, now he sees the opposite process. He sees the chariot brings the glory of God back to the temple through the eastern gate, the same gate through which the Shekhinah left. Now, bringing the Shekhinah back into the house of God, the temple, the term that he uses, Vehine Male Kvod Adonai Habayit. The glory of God fills the house. Why this is significant? Because thinking about the first temple that was built by Solomon, Ki Male Kvod Adonai et Bet Adonai, almost the same words are used to describe the Hashrat Shekhinah when the Shekhinah dwelt in the temple, the first temple that was built by Shlomo. So now in his vision, Yechezkel sees the Shekhinah returns the same way that it left through the eastern gate, but this time it's the third temple. Or in what he thought is going to be the second, but whatever. We know it was. Okay. Now, what is the source of that particular term? It's the end of the completion of the Mishkan, the tabernacle that was built by Moshe. Uchvod Adonai maleh et hamishkan. When the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was completed, the glory of God filled the Mishkan. So we have pretty much the same term that is used to describe the Mishkan, which is the prototype for the temple, the same term used for the first temple, and now Yechezkel is using the same term to describe the future return of the Shekhinah to the temple. Now, if you remember, in chapter 37, we dealt with the vision of the dry bones. Remember that? Good. Now, and we said that that prophecy has two parts to it. First, he's talking about the body, right? That those bones all of a sudden have flesh on them. And veruach ein bahem. However, they have no spirit. Right? So first we're talking about the first stage was that those bones became alive in that sense that, not alive, but it becomes a body. Only in the second stage, God brought the spirit. And remember, the text, he uses the same term as in the book of Bereshit, in the story of creation, vayipach. Right? It's this idea of ruach, correct? The spirit, in the same terminology as we use to describe the story in creation for creating Adam. So just like over there, we have two stages. Here too, we have two stages. First stage is building the building. It's the construction. You have the building. This is what we saw in chapters 40 through 42. All the dimensions and the courtyard, the gates, the walls. Okay. Right? Now It's the second stage. It's when Hashra'at Shechina, what we call, when the Shechina dwells, Kvod Hashem aleh et hamishkan. Right? The glory of God fills. So you have a building, now it's going to be functional. Because the building, up until that point, is just a building. Okay? And if we look at that in that text, let's see a couple of you remember וכמראה המראה אשר ראיתי כמראה אשר ראיתי בבואי לשחט את העיר ומראות כמראה אשר ראיתי אל נהר כבר, all that stuff, all those words and all those terminology and all those, he's sending us back to the beginning of the book. He says, remember the visions that I had back then when I was prophesying about the destruction of Yerushalayim? Remember when I was in Nehar Kvar, that place in Babylonia? Remember, Yechezkel is already in Babylonia for a long time. He's already in Babel, right? So Al Nahar Kvar, that's in the very beginning of the book. So he's making all those connections. And the reason is very simple. Back then, it what we called Nevuat Puranut, right? It was the prophecy of the bad stuff. He prophesizes about the destruction of Yerushalayim and the temple is going to be destroyed and God is going to leave Yerushalayim and the spirit of God is going to leave the temple through the eastern gate, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff that we learn in the beginning of the book. Now, it's the complete opposite. And therefore, to create that parallelism, to create that connection, he's using the same terminology. He's using the same terms, the same words in order to describe the opposite process. Okay? Remember that word, like that famous pasuk hey, Vatisaini ruach. Now we say it all the time, Vatisaini ruach vayishma acharai kol ra'ash gadol. That's the famous pasuk that we quote every day in the tefillah, right? That he used before. We talked about it. It's the pasuk from Kedusha also, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. That's Isaiah. Remember, we talked about the structure of Kedusha, that we have the pasuk from Isaiah, the pasuk from Yechezkel, and then we have the pasuk from Tehillim, and what Chazal connected all three in order to create one bigger picture. We talked about that many, many times. Okay, let's move on. Verses 6 through 9. What?
Question?
Yeah.
It says in verse 6.
Yeah.
Vayomer Elai ben Adam, which means the prophet.
That's pasuk 7. Yeah. Right.
So it kind of describe God as Ish.
No. If you remember, when it comes to the destruction of the temple, that there's like Ish levush habadim. Remember him? If I say so. We talked about this Ish, this mysterious, and it was the whole discussion whether it's the angel Gabriel or. So that's a reference to the same Ish. We're going to talk about that. Let me read verses 6 through 9, and we're going to discuss that as well a little bit. Here we go. וישמע מדבר אליי מהבית, ואיש היה עומד אצלי. ויאמר אליי, בן אדם, את מקום כיסאי ואת מקום כפות רגלי, אשר אשכון שם בתוך בני ישראל לעולם, this is very important, ולא יטמאו עוד בית ישראל שם קודשי, המה ומלכיהם בזנותם, ובפגרי מלכיהם במותם. בתיתם סיפם את ציפי, ומזוזתם אצל מזוזתי, בהכיר ביני וביניהם, ותמאו את שם קודשי בתועבותם אשר עשו, ואכל אותם באפי, עתה ירחקו את זנותם ופגרי מלכיהם ממני, ושכנתי בתוכם לעולם. This is very significant. Okay, let's go into the English, see what he says. I heard him addressing himself to me from the temple, i.e. God, and there was a man standing next to me. He said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of my footstool, where I will dwell amid the children of Israel forever. The house of Israel will no longer defile my holy name, they and their kings with their promiscuous idolatry and with the corpse of their kings and with their high places. By their placing their threshold near my threshold, this is significant. We're going to talk about it in a second. And their doorpost next to my doorpost, with but a wall between me and them, whereby they defile my holy name with the abomination they committed, so that I consumed them in my anger. Now they will distance their promiscuous idolatry and the corpse of their kings from me, that I may dwell among them forever. Correct. Absolutely. That's the prophecy. God has been talking like the whole book.
What are the corpse of the
We're going to talk about the corpse in a second, Shoshana. Good catch. So Yechezkel hears the voice from inside the building, i.e. Beit HaMikdash. Why this is significant? Because if you remember, going back to the times of the tabernacle of the Mishkan, Vayishma et hakol midaber elav. It's the same idea. Moshe heard the voice from inside. Okay, over there it was a tent, but here it's a building. Principle is the same principle. Furthermore, we're going to see that there's, and this is perhaps the best example, this section, there's going to be, and there is, an attempt to connect this future temple with the tabernacle in the desert and kind of like distance it from the temple that was destroyed. The model that Yechezkel is prophesizing, or the model that he's talking about as like the ultimate, or what is that we're striving for, is the Mishkan, is not the temple that Shlomo built. We're going to talk about it in a second. Okay, so he hears that voice from inside the building. And that voice explained, Yechezkel, the circumstances under which the temple was destroyed. Right? Not only that, he tells him also of the repair. Why? Because that's what's going to prevent a future destruction. So he says to him, that was a problem, and in the future, that's not going to happen again, and therefore the temple is going to stay forever. That's what he says. Yes.
They cannot imagine, the prophets do not imagine that there will be a second destruction.
Maybe. I'm not so sure that I agree with that. I'll tell you why. By the fact that he tells him, this is what needs to happen in order to prevent, so it'll stay forever, it means that if you don't do that, it will be destroyed again. Okay? And by the way, just to frame it, based on the approach that most of the Mefarshim took, and that's the approach that we took in the last, couple of months, when he talks about the temple, in the understanding of Chazal, it's not the second temple, but it's the third temple. Now, he doesn't know, Yechezkel doesn't know there's going to be a second temple that's going to be destroyed. So now we are like in retrospect, right? But that's what Chazal, and we talked about the reasons why Chazal decided this is going to be the third temple.
Third temple, and it's almost like the concept of second temple is going to be like.
And you know what? What's much more significant is the reasons, and we're going to delve into that in a second. Yeah.
Very specific abomination of stealing. That's not why the second temple is destroyed. It was destroyed.
He's going to talk, and he's going to correct, but he's going to talk about the first temple, because at that point, It's only the first one that was destroyed, right? Yechezkel lives in the last couple of years of the temple, and then, correct.
But they didn't. They did half. But they didn't do it. Nothing else.
Correct. Okay. So from the paragraph that we just read, the kind of like the main idea, what was like the nucleus of the problem? What? It's lack of separation. That's what basically it says. It's a lack of separation, geographical, and let's call it mental separation between the palace and everything that it represents, and the temple and everything that it represents. Now, some of you learned with me, trying to remember when, where, what series. Correct. But we talked, I don't remember, one of those classes in the last 10 years or so. We discussed this idea of like all those huge monumental building construction project that Shlomo HaMelech commissioned. That was, by the way, pretty much the reason or the background for the split of the kingdom, right? What happened was, after building the temple, he started building his palace, and then palace for his wives and this and that and whatever. And it's like, it was like a huge project that took for years and years and years, a lot of taxes, it was difficult. When Shlomo HaMelech dies and Rechavam, his son, becomes the king, you remember the famous story, the elders come to him, and they ask for a break, and he says, forget about that. It's going to be even harder, right? And then the kingdom, because of that, split, and the kingdom of Israel takes Yerovam ben Nevat. Yerovam ben Nevat already tried to rebel a couple of years before that, and he ran to Egypt. So they take him from Egypt, bring him back. They make him the king of Israel, and then you have the kingdom of Yehuda with Rechavam. So we already know that this was a major problem, but Shlomo had control. But soon after, okay, so that was already like difficult. All that construction, that was a major thing. And it's not only that, it's the people felt that it's absolutely unnecessary. Everybody joined the project of building the temple. That's not a problem. They raised the money, that everything was fine. When it started to expand, and the palace and the second palace and this and that and whatever, people said like, yeah, that was not the deal. And it created a lot of tension. Okay. So what is God saying here? The problem is that the palace was too close to the temple, and their graves, the graves of the kings, we're going to talk about it in a second, and also all sorts of places where they had avodah zarah, that was too close to the temple. Now, I want to ask you something. We learned most of the book. Nowhere it talks about this proximity as being the problem or the reason for the destruction of the temple. They talk about abominations, they talk about avodah zarah, they talk about shfichut damim, they talk about idolatry, they talk about murder, they talk about all that stuff, injustice, right? We talked about it for a year. Well, proximity, like seriously, God like cares that he's a neighbor with the palace? That's the problem? Or maybe there's something more significant here. Yeah. Okay. Proximity.
Is it the right translation?
Well, he talks about it. He says here, his words. He says, He doesn't use a he says, well, later on he said, now they will distance their, so it's the opposite of distance, the proximity. That was the problem. Yes. Okay, so this is part of the answer. It's not about physical proximity so much as about, yes, Shoshana?
It was a time of peace. It was a time of everyone was really, they had a good situation, and they started mingling with their neighbors.
Okay, but that's not what he's referring to. I think that what the prophecy is talking about.
When they, because
No, I get it. You're correct, but I don't think that this is what the prophecy is talking about. The prophecy is talking about this.
the services in their temples were more interesting than ours.
Okay, it's the idea of blurring the boundaries. Okay, there's a blur of the boundaries. I go to the temple, but it's also the palace is there. There's like gardens that are associated with the temple, but it's also the graves of some of the kings is also there. What is it? It's the idea of putting myself as a human being, and I don't care if you're a king, in that same level of God. That's the problem. That is the problem. And that was part of the problem with Shlomo HaMelech, and that was part of his default, right? You remember, at the end of his life, he's involved with Avodah Zarah, right? Nashav hitu et levavo. Shlomo HaMelech is involved with Avodah Zarah, with forms of Avodah Zarah at the end of his life. I get it. He has a lot of wives, but the point being is that because he was the smartest guy, and what was his sin? Right? The Torah says, "Lo yarbeh lo kesef v'zahav, lo yarbeh lo nashim, lo yarbeh lo susim." Right? That the king cannot have too much money. The king cannot have gold. Cannot have too many horses. Cannot have too many wives. And what did Shlomo says? Basically, the psychic. We talked about it in the past. He said, "Well, this is for the common people, people with regular brain. I get it, the rationale, but for me, I get it. I'm smarter than that. I understand what's the rationale behind that. And therefore, I'm going to avoid that. That's not going to be a problem. So I can have all that money and gold. I can have so many wives. I can have so many horses. All those boundaries that are applicable to the regular common people. Of course.
He tolerated the worship of idols by his wives.
Okay. So, and that's a mindset. That's a mindset that that causes us to kind of, the boundaries are blurred. Like you start seeing yourself as, a little bit. And I think this is what he's talking about. He's not talking about the physical proximity. God couldn't care less. God doesn't need that house. It's for us. But it's what is it, the message that you send? Okay. And if the compound of the palace, I think it was even bigger than the temple, that sends a message. So yes, you are Shlomo HaMelech and you are so smart and you understand and you blah, 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 blah. By the way, that rationale happens also even today in halakha. So sometimes when we look at halakha, it's not only understanding what's behind it. Sometimes you just have to do that, because if it's going to be up to you, no, I know that I'm not going to find myself in that. It happens to everybody. Okay, it happens to everybody. So, yeah.
It doesn't say directly that they were close, but it says.
Yeah, absolutely, it does.
It says which
My doorpost next to their doorpost. Yeah, that's proximity.
On the compound and took away the open area where people go to gather.
It was, you had to go through, as far as I remember, I'm trying to remember, you had to go through the compound or something of the palace in order to get to the Beit HaMikdash. And it was so, like his wife will have, especially someone will have like a better view so they could see who's coming and who's leaving. Yes. Absolutely. Correct. That's exactly the point. It's not about being smart. You can be as smart as Shlomo, and it's still going to come. It's still going to happen because intellect is not enough. If there are rules, there's a good if the Torah says certain rules, there's, don't think that you are above the law. I gotta.
Arik,
Yes, Shoshana, and then I have to continue. We're not going to finish.
Only good if we are Amlet of Levadad Yishkon.
Okay. Fine. So, as we said, in the chapters in Melachim Aleph that talks about the construction of Beit HaMikdash, the whole compound, there's a lot of description of this proximity of the buildings. And what happens is sort of a blurring of the boundaries, both symbolic and the physical. They go hand in hand. And that becomes a huge problem. If all the kings were true tzaddikim, then it's not a problem. However, they were not. And they were practicing Avodah Zarah. And when that happens, then it becomes a huge problem because it's not only that they're doing Avodah Zarah, they do Avodah Zarah in tremendous proximity to what represent the complete opposite. Now, somebody asked me about the graves. And we know at least two of the last, some in the Davidic dynasty, Menashe and Ammon, both of them, it says specifically in Melachim Bet that they were buried in Gan Uzzah. And Gan Uzzah, there's a machloket, there's a debate among the Mefarshim where exactly that place is. However, they all agree that it's some area in the vicinity of the temple. Okay? So, and what was the idea behind that? Why would a king want to be buried right there in that proximity to the temple? Well, because
the Goyim do that.
Ego. Correct. And not only that, you pass my grave on your way to the temple. Okay? So that again is another kind of strike, or not a strike, but there's another way, kind of like that the temple, yeah. Okay, and that is what God is talking about in this prophecy. This blurring, this idea, you got to be clear what is human, right? The kings, their palaces, all that kind of stuff, versus the divine. And this has to be a separation because they are very different. And what he says that in the future, that deficiency, that problem has to be and will be worked out. It's got to be resolved. Why? If you jump into chapter 45, we're going to learn that the temple, the compound of the temple is going to be detached and a little bit further away from the city and what they call Beit HaNasi, the house of whatever, which is the palace basically. And so you create that separation both physically, and that contributes or promises the let's call it theological or religious or psychological separation as well. Okay, so after that virtual tour that Yechezkel has in the temple, God approaches him with, kind of final words of that journey and the purpose of it. Okay, let's take a look at verses 10 through 12. אתה בן אדם, הגד את בית ישראל את הבית ויקלמו מעוונותיהם ומדדו את תוכנית. ואם נכלמו מכל אשר עשו, צורת הבניין ותכונתו ומוצאיו ומובאיו וכל צורותיו ואת כל חוקותיו וכל צורותיו וכל תורותיו הודע אותם וכתוב לעיניהם, וישמרו את כל צורתו ואת כל חוקותיו ועשו אותם. זו תורת הבית על ראש ההר, כל גבולו סביב סביב קודש קודשים, הנה זאת תורת הבית. In English, you son of man, tell the house of Israel about the temple and let them be ashamed of their iniquities and calculate the temple's design. If they become ashamed of all that they have done, then make known to them the form of the temple and its design, its exits and its entrances, and all its buildings forms, all its laws, all its designs, and all its teachings, and write all this down before their eyes, so that they may safeguard its entire form and all its rules and fulfill them. This is the teaching regarding the temple. Atop the mountain, its entire boundary all around shall be most holy. Behold, this is the teaching regarding the temple. Now there's another clarification. Why, and what is it, the clarification, why he needs to deliver all that message to the people of Israel? So the idea is that people would know, notify them, they need to understand about the building the temple again. That is going to cause them to do tshuva, to repent. And why? Because they see, obviously that's the prophecy, they see that God is going to return, the glory of God, the Shekhinah is going to return to the temple, that temple that will be built in the future. Now, this call to the Jewish people to lehikalem me'avonot, right? He says to them, V'kalmu me'avonoteihem. How do they translate it? Ashamed of their iniquities. Okay? This term, that's already, we saw that term in chapter 36. Boshu v'kalmu midarcheichem beit Yisrael. Okay? To be ashamed of your iniquity. Why this is significant? Because that's a prerequisite. It's not only tshuva. As we mentioned in one of the previous chapters, everybody will have a form of nevuah, some sort of a degree of prophecy. And that's a prerequisite for that. Ve'im nichlemu mikol asher asu. Only when they ashamed of everything that they've done, all the bad stuff that they have done, only then, tzurat habayit utchunato, all the form and the teachings and the law, and all the details associated with the building, hoda otam, let them know. So they need to have remorse. They need to go through a process of tshuva in order to achieve a certain spiritual state. And only when they achieve that spiritual state, they can be notified with all that information about the future temple. Okay? And he's calling them, he said, learn it. You got to learn all the details, the design, the measurements, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff very well. Why? because in the future we'll have to build it according to that particular plan. And only when you do that, the Shekhinah will return. From here, Yechezkel is going to describe the Mizbeach specifically, and to be Mizbach HaOlah, the burnt offering, the Mizbeach, the altar of the burnt offering. Now, we saw before that Mizbeach, I'm not going to go crazy with all the details, so I'm going to skip the reading of verses 13 through 17. It's just the measurements of the Mizbeach. But we already learned that this is going to be in the inner courtyard. Okay? Now, so there are a couple of psukim, 13 to 17, that talks about describing that Mizbeach. And there's, again, like in previous chapters, there's a lot of machloket, there's a lot of debates about like what exactly it means, blah, blah, blah. What I would like to, kind of like in general idea, if you could picture that, think about 4 boxes that are not square, but rectangular boxes. Thank you very much. And you have the top one is called Ariel or Harel, and that was 12 by 12 amot, 12, but it right. And then you have under that you have the Azara Gdola, the big Azara, a little bit bigger. It's 14 amot. And then you have underneath that you have the Azara Ktana, that was 16 amot, and then beneath that was the Gav HaMizbeach, that was 18 amot. Okay, so it's like kind of like 4 rectangular boxes, one on top of the other. That was the shape. That's the shape of that Mizbeach. Fine. Now, after he sees how the Mizbeach looks like, he hears about the inauguration of the Mizbeach, and this is important. Let's go to verses 18 through 27. ויאמר אלי, בן אדם, כה אמר אדוני אלוהים, אלה חוקות המזבח ביום העשותו, להעלות עליו עולה ולזרוק עליו דם. ונתת אל הכהנים הלוויים אשר הם מזרע צדוק הקרובים אליי, נאום אדוני אלוהים לשרתני, פר בן בקר לחטאת, ולקחת מדמו ונתת על 4 קרנותיו ואל 4 פינות העזרה ואל הגבול סביב וחיטטת אותו וכיפרתהו, ולקחת את הפר החטאת ושרפו במפקד הבית מחוץ למקדש, וביום השני תקריב שעיר עזים תמים לחטאת וחיטו את המזבח כאשר חיטו בפר. Again, it's a lot of technicalities of how the korban is going to be done. Right? So the first pasuk says, then he said to me, son of man, thus said the Lord Hashem, these are the laws of the altar on the day that is made, to offer a burnt offering on it and to sprinkle blood on it. And then he goes into all the details. And he said, who's going to do that? The Kohanim from the family of Tzadok. Right? We talked about it in the past, and we said that there's going to be a change. There's going to be a change in the status of the Kohanim. Unlike the first temple, where all the Kohanim were involved in the service, in the avodah, in bringing the korbanot, here in the future one is only from the family of Tzadok, because they stayed loyal throughout the time. All the rest of them, there's going to be some sort of a change in their status. They're going to be in a similar status to the rest of the Leviim. They're still going to be involved with the temple, but they were not going to be permitted to do the korbanot themselves. This is, I don't know if it really happened in reality in the second temple. According to Chazal, all those descriptions apply to the third temple. According to Chazal, because even though he's talking about time that precedes the second temple, the way the description that we have of the second temple from the Mishnah and the Gemara are very different. And we talked about the reason for that. It's either because they didn't understand exactly what to do and how to build it, or that they felt that they were not in a spiritual madrega, in a spiritual place that they can do that. Okay, so these are the main two approaches why the discrepancy between what Yechezkel is talking and what happened in reality in the second temple, which led to the conclusion of Chazal that Yechezkel is talking about a future, i.e. not a second temple, but the third temple.
Weren't there a lot of foreigners that were helping from
Yes, so
the problem?
that was part of it, yeah, but Yechezkel is not dealing with that stuff. Okay, so this is like all those technicalities of how to do the korban. It's not like super interesting. I want to jump into the pasuk 26. שבעת ימים יחפרו את המזבח ותיארו אותו ומילאו ידיו ויכלו את הימים והיה ביום השמיני והלאה יעשו הכהנים על המזבח את עולותיכם ואת שלמיכם ורציתי אתכם נאום אדוני אלוהים. 26-27 For 7 days they shall purify the altar and they shall cleanse it and inaugurate it. When these days have passed, it shall be that from the 8th day onward, the Kohanim may prepare on the altar your burnt offering and your peace offering, and I will accept you with favor, the word of the Lord Hashem. Okay, so what do we have there? That process of the inauguration of the Mizbeach is immediately is a deja vu to, thank you, to the Mishkan. Again, the Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, the 7 days of the inauguration of the Mishkan. In both stories, both places, we're talking about a process of sanctifying, right, of inaugurating in order to start the avodah, the service in the new place of holy, the Mishkan, the Mikdash. In both times, the process lasted 7 days. In both of them, we have a bull for chatat offering, and you sprinkle from its blood on the corners of the altar. And in both of them, that bull is being burnt outside the courtyard. So it's very, very similar process. It's, yes, almost. And if you were with me in that series that we had a couple of years ago that I called Deja Vu, Parallel Stories, you know that when in Tanach we see stories with a lot of similarities, it's because they want to tell you that it's not the same. When you have a lot of similarities, then the difference is highlighted. So let's delve into that. Yes, it's always done on purpose. What was the purpose or what was the functionality of Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, or the 7 days of inauguration in the desert for the Mishkan? That was no, that was correct. But what was the purpose? The purpose was Hakdasha. Okay, it was this idea of changing the status or giving that legitimacy for the Kohanim so they can start functioning, they can start do their work. It was all about the Kohanim. Right? V'kidashtam v'chihanuli. That phrase comes again and again and again and again so many times in that description. Whatever. It's about the people. It's about the people who are going to do the job. Here, are we talking about the people? Not at all. We're talking about the object. We're talking about the altar itself. This is very, very significant. Now, why is that? What's going on here? Why all of a sudden I'm highlighting the altar itself rather than the people? And what I think, you may disagree with me, but I think that there's a shift in focus. You know that term, like, no man is bigger than the job or something like that. Everybody is replaceable, all that kind of stuff. I think this is what's going on here. In the Mishkan, and later on in the first temple, it was about the people. Aaron HaKohen, Elazar, or Echad Mibanav HaKohanim. You got to be born into that family, right? There's like all this, that stuff. It's like predestined, right? We're going to see that also later on in the Davidic dynasty. You got to be from, right? What happens much like it's a process that starts here that's going to be extremely accelerated later on after the second temple. What happens? I'm going to come back to this, but what happens after the second temple when there's no korbanot anymore? And there's no malchut, there's no kingship. What happened? Tefillah, right. And what's the main difference? Okay, both a form of service, but anybody can. It becomes from something that is given to a specific group, it becomes everybody's. What is it that and before destruction of the temple, who were like the leaders? Were the Kohanim, they were the teachers. What Chazal teach us after that? Beketer Torah ole al kulan. What really matters is what? Learning. And who can learn? Anybody. There's a shift. Correct. The status of the Kohanim go down. Okay, so we give them the first aliyah. Okay, they duchan here in the Chagim in Israel, they do it every day. Big deal. But it's not the Kohanim that are the important people. Who are the leaders of the Jewish, the teachers, the rabbis, whatever. And that could be anyone. That could be a Kohen, that could be Israel, that could be a Mamzer. Could be anyone. Not only that, the Gemara talks about it. Mamzer Talmid Chacham Kodem LeKohen Gadol. Right? There's something that completely changes after the destruction of the second temple, right? And because of that, Judaism is still alive. Of course, those changes had to happen, otherwise Judaism would have died, right? So there's a shift from predestined, whatever, destiny or whatever you want to call it, because of birth, because of that, Kohen, you're the king, whatever, all that kind of stuff, to no. It's not about where you come from, but rather, what do you do? What do you do? It's totally up to you. And therefore, the Mishnah says that even a mamzer precedes a Kohen Gadol if the Kohen Gadol is, not knowledgeable, but the mamzer is. Just a sec. Same goes, by the way, there's another Mishnah, I forgot where, that takes it even another step further, that says what? Mipnei ma bneihem shel talmidei chachamim einam talmidei chachamim shelo yomru Torah kardom lachtor ba. In other words, there's almost this tendency that the children of talmidei chachamim, of great scholars, are not going to be great scholars. Why? Because we don't want to have anyone to say that this is something that goes with the genes, something that you can pass to your children. You want to be a scholar, you're going to sit down and learn. This is your effort. This doesn't matter who your father is. It's all okay. So this is like a massive change in Jewish philosophy and practice and theology that happens at the second temple. However, the roots for that, the origin starts already here.
That's why the description of what is bad.
Correct. So now this is why we understand why we highlight the Mizbeach, but not the Kohanim, because it's about the work, and the work can be done by anyone who is worthy. Okay? That's the shift. So why is it that the Kohanim Bnei Tzadok, only the family of Tzadok? Because they didn't sin. They stayed loyal for years and years and years. This is why they earned their position as the Kohanim who's going to, okay? So I kind of de-emphasize all that status of the Kohanim, and I emphasize the status of the Mizbeach. It's not about the Kohanim, it's about the Mizbeach. And the Mizbeach is going to be, and who is going to work on the Mizbeach? Whoever is worthy. Okay? And whoever is going to be the later on, who is going to be the leader? Whoever is worthy. Doesn't matter what family you were born to. That is the shift. And that and the origin for that shift that happens later on with Yochanan ben Zakkai after the second temple starts here. So it's a slow, gradual process that culminates later on.
So it's kind of political revolution.
Of course. Okay. So we have the 7 days. The last thing that I want to talk about is we need like 5 minutes of the 8th day. Right? Again, I'm going to compare the 8th day here with the 8th day, not the band, the 8th day that the Mishkan is like the story of the Mishkan. What happened in the 8th day? That was the big celebration, Parashat Shmini. And the big celebration, Ki hayom nira Hashem alechem. Right? It's the completion of that process of those 7 days of practicing and dedicating the Kohanim and all that kind of stuff. And what happened at the end? Okay, Nadav and Avihu's story also, right? It ended up in a tremendous tragedy. However, but what happened before that? It was tremendous celebration. Everybody saw like all that vision and the fire and the whole thing, blah, blah, blah. Right, okay, great celebration, fine. What happened here? What Yechezkel is talking about? Is there any celebration? No.
No.
Nothing. Just said that from that day, the service is going to be done according to its laws, according to routine. Okay. What does it tell us? What does it tell us? Things are not going to be the same, but that's not the point. The point is that we don't need all this pompous stuff. It's about the people. It's about the routine. It's about what needs to be done. I don't need the big celebration. I don't need the acolytes. I don't need all that kind of stuff. I want tachlis. I want work. I want people who are worthy of working, and that's it. We don't need all that stuff. And that goes hand in hand with this approach that he talks about against the temple of Shlomo. We don't need the big palaces. We don't need the wealth. We don't need all that big show. We don't need all that stuff. We go back to the basics. We go back to what our model? The Mishkan was a simple tent.
Jeremiah.
Yechezkel, yeah.
Question.
Correct. So, correct, I get it. Because what? And the message here, because God's presence is what important, and what? It's not dependent on the korbanot.
Right.
It depends on merits of the Jewish people. It depends whether you did tshuva. He says, "V'shachanti betocham leolam, v'ratziti etchem neum Adonai Elohim." I'm going to be there. I'm going to dwell. My Shekhinah is going to be there in that temple because I want to. It's whether you're going to bring korbanot or not. You remember last week we talked about the whole debate whether the third temple is going to have korbanot or not. We say it's a machloket. It's a machloket. But here, yeah, he talks about korbanot. He talks, correct. He talks about, that's fine. He talks about korbanot, no doubt about it. But the point is what Hashem says, you can bring all the korbanot in the world. This is not going to make me dwell in that building. You know what's going to get me there? You. Your actions, your merits, not your korbanot. And that's probably the nucleus for that debate that we dealt with last week and 2 weeks ago, whether we're going to have korbanot in the third temple or not. Here, God says, "V'ratziti etchem." I want you. Remember, I'm going to fast forward. Malachi, Chagai. They talk about, who wants that? God says, look, I don't need that stuff. I need you to do the right things. I need you to create a society of justice and compassion. I want you to, I don't need that stuff. Okay? So yes, we're still in this idea of korbanot, and yes, we need that because that's a form of communication, and that's what people, okay, I get it. We talked about it for a year, but God says, that's not for me, that's for you. Okay. Now, the last point that I want to talk about, what is Yechezkel's role here? If you look, like I kind of like skipped those psukim, but it says, "V'natata el hakohanim," right? And then, "V'lakachta midamo, v'natata al arba karnotav, v'chiteta oto, v'lakachta et." That means God tells him in the prophecy, you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to, meaning in the process of bringing the korban. So all those actions are connected to Yechezkel himself. Again, machloket. Machloket between him and Farshim. Is it that indeed Yechezkel is supposed to be doing all that stuff? Yes. According to some of the commentators, okay, Radak, for example, Radak says, yes, it means God tells Yechezkel he's going to be the high priest. Listen, remember the prerequisite for the third temple. People have to be worthy. That could happen anytime. Maybe in Yechezkel's times also. I get it. But when the fact that he says to him, you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, from that, some of them Farshim claimed that indeed Yechezkel, if conditions are right, obviously, he in potential going to be the Kohen Gadol and going to do all those jobs. However, other Mefarshim disagree and say, no, the prophecy was given to Yechezkel. So Yechezkel is kind of representative of Shevet Levi. Remember, Yechezkel himself is a Kohen. Yechezkel ben Buzi min haKohanim asher ba'anatot. So he is representative of Kohanim, whoever they are, all of them, and it's not that he himself is going to do all those actions. So if I need to summarize that, to me, why is it that the temple was destroyed? Blurring the boundaries. The first one. Blur. Well, Yechezkel lives in that time of history, right? It's the blurring the boundaries. Is when we start we people, all people, start thinking of ourselves as gods. That's the root. That's the problem. Okay. Okay,
It's
that's
very repetitive.
you want to bring the Geulah. You better understand that very, very well. Make that separation. And God says also, my presence, my Shekhinah, it's not about the korbanot. It's not about any of that stuff. I get it. I'm going to play along because you people need that. And we talked about it last year. What is the reason for korbanot? You remember we talked about the Rambam, and he talks about this idea that it was a necessary stage in the development of the Jewish people and people in general. You know, that particular point of history, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. I don't want to go into that. But God says, okay, I'm going to play along. You need that. That is fine. It's a vehicle through which you can communicate with me. You feel that, you know, you need that. You need a temple. You need a building. That's fine. But that's not, as long as you remember the boundaries, as long as you remember that it's not about the building. Because if it's about the building, then I'm going to build a bigger building, then it becomes also about you. So as long as you maintain those boundaries, as long as you understand what is it that we're talking about, then you can practice from a tent. You don't need any of that stuff. You don't need a korbanot. You don't need a big building. You don't need kingdom. You don't need wealth. You don't need the horses. You don't need the gold. You don't need anything. And if there's anything that we learn, especially like in where our world is today, less is more. We want authenticity. We want back to the simplicity. We don't need all that. What? We don't need the hoopla. We don't need the, I mean, it's all wonderful and great as long as the message is clear and there's no blurring of boundaries. In other words, I just read this article. Forget about now the war in Israel, which is unusual times, but one of the type of organizations in the nonprofit world that is hurting most is the big organizations, right? The federations and the JNFs and the whatever. Why? Because it's big. It's a lot of people, a lot of salaries, and people say, I don't want that. I want my money to go directly to who needs that. So people staying and the smaller organizations that have only one person and whatever, or it's just like one phone call and whatever, and make it boom, boom, boom. That is the ones that, why? Because it's in our core, we understand that, okay, sometimes it's nice. You need the building, you need the whatever, you need the big galas, you need the celebration, you need all. But at times of challenge, you can go back to the basics. And this is the model that Yechezkel is and Kadosh Baruch Hu through Yechezkel is telling us. As great as the first temple was, the model for the future one is the simple tent in the desert.
Question.
No, we have to read chapters 40 to 42. Chapters 40 to 42 gives a very clear description of how the building is going to be. But again, it's not about the building. It's about what the building is going to do. What's going to happen there? And we discussed that last week with, the approach of Rav Kook and the mix with Herzl and the whole thing, remember? And we said that this is going to be some sort of a Supreme Court, like international Supreme Court. Is going to be an academy, international academy for justice and the ways of Hashem and how to live moral lives, etc. So again, can you do it on Zoom even? You don't need a building? Yeah. But if it's for the right purpose, then do it. Build a building. If the korban helps you connect with God, by all means, bring the korban. We're not against korbanot. As long as you remember what's the purpose, that it's the ultimate, the purpose is to connect with God. If the korban by itself becomes what you connected with, then you're missing the whole point. That was the fault. And because of that, the temples fell. Okay, next week, same time, same place, and we're going to continue with chapter 44.
One question.
I don't care.
Why not?
I don't think the greatest decision is fine, but I know that sometimes people think my life is unfolding.
It's fine. Next week, Hanukkah. I'll talk to Robin. We'll have donuts. Yes, Shoshana.
One question. You said the same things already through your whole studies. What we didn't do